One of the things that I wanted to start our conversation with is that any civil war is as much an ideological conflict as it is a military conflict or a combat. And although it seems to us like 150 years later that the two sides were lined up pretty neatly, at the time, I think certainly from the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 to the events that you've just described, but really going back much further than 1860, it became a crisis of conscience for every American citizen to really think about what it meant to them to be an American, what they valued most, what they cared most about, and what they wanted their country to be moving forward.
Yeah, I like what you said about it's more than a military struggle, and I have to say that despite this sort of battle scene that I just read, for the most part, that sort of Civil War history stuff about whose cavalry went charging over which hill against whose infantry, I mean, it kind of makes my eyes glaze over, and so that's not the kind of book that I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book that was about, as Ron said, these struggles going on within individual Americans' hearts and minds. But for me, it goes even, when you say it's not military, it's also ideological. It also goes sort of beyond that. I think any war, and especially a civil war, as we're seeing in our own times in places like Benghazi, in places like Baghdad, is a sort of a complicated affair in which people are tugged in sort of different directions all at once. You see people pulled by political feelings, you see people pulled by religious loyalties, pulled by family ties, pulled very strongly by ties of self-interest also. I have a friend who's a correspondent, Middle East correspondent for the New York Times, and he's been going back and forth to the Middle East in the midst of all this stuff going on there, which is interesting that he's sort of living a real civil war, and I'm writing about an old one, but his perspective is great. And a few weeks ago, in fact, I called him to see if he wanted to meet for dinner in D.C. that night, and took a really long time for his cell phone to ring, and then there was all this sort of loud yelling in the background. And he said, hey, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of an insane Arab mob in Benghazi. I said, oh, I guess you're not free for dinner tonight. He said, no. But he did get back a few days later, and we talked about this. We went out for brunch instead of dinner, and I said, so, it's so strange looking at this war going on in Libya. But who are these people who are defending the Gaddafi government? Who are these people defending this regime that has, clearly, first of all, it stands for a guy who's just done horrible things to his country, to his own people. And second of all, he's now got sort of the entire civilized world lining up against him for the cause of pounding him into rubble. Who sticks with someone at a moment like that, and why? It stands for no perceptible ideology, as far as I can tell. And so my friend Bobby said, it's the people who in one way or another have self-interest associated with this regime. They've built their careers on their place within this regime, and it's very hard to give up. And so that really, this was after my book had actually already been printed, but I wish I'd known it in time for when I wrote the book, because that really spoke to me of the ways that civil wars in particular are such multivalent, complicated affairs. And so that's something that I tried to get at in this book. And in fact, it started for me with the story of one particular man in my own state of Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, near where I live, who was pulled in many directions at the outset of the Civil War. I don't want to go on, but maybe that gives you enough of a sense of where I'm coming from.
Well, the point about self-interest is definitely interesting to me, in that I think one of the great things about what 1861, the book, does about 1861, the period, is certainly one of the things that you do is you puncture the whole lost cause mythology of the rise of the Confederacy. One, by pointing out, as others have, that it's like, this wasn't about states' rights, this wasn't about tariffs. If it was about states' rights, the only rights in question were the rights to maintain a slave economy. But the other aspect of puncturing the lost cause myth that I was particularly interested to read about was this idea that rather than sort of like an active alternative ideology or alternative vision of the government, a lot of what the Confederacy was simply reactive certainly to the election of Abraham Lincoln, but then continuing to react. I mean, it was basically like Jefferson Davis and the others, and certainly Governor Perkins in South Carolina, essentially backed themselves into a corner, over and over again until there was nothing else for them to do but start a war.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and at one point I say, the Confederate cause wasn't so much a cause as an effect. As you say, it was a reactive stratagem, sort of tricked out in these ex post facto justifications of what they were up to. The doctrine of states' rights being, of course, the most obvious one. But yeah, I think it was a movement that was very largely motivated by those sorts of factors that we're talking about, rather than motivated by deeper ideological commitments. But on the other hand, you could probably say that about many, if not most, revolutions. Perhaps the Revolution of 1776 was in its own way that as well. But I do think that, well, when you say that my book punctures the myth of the lost cause, I have a feeling it'll take a lot more than my book to ever puncture that. There have been a lot of books, probably better than mine, that have tried their best, and it's a sort of an impervious balloon.
Another thing that I want to talk about in terms of what you do is, we were talking about this a little bit before, and in terms of the idea of that personal moment of conscience and reflection that every American had to go through in late 1860, early 1861. I was sort of comparing it, as you mentioned in the book, and I think as other people have picked up on, that kind of moment of reflection as Americans that we've gone through in the last decade, certainly starting with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, reflecting on what it means for us to be Americans. And one of my favorite takes on the whole red state, blue state phenomenon is the idea that, well, if you really look at the ways that people are voting across the country, that we're essentially a bunch of purple states. Some of them are a little more violet, towards the red zone, and some of them are a little more towards the blue zone. But if you look at the patterns, it's purple all around. That it's not that you can just line people up into easy blocks. Mm-hmm. And although, on the surface, the Civil War, the blue and the gray, as you point out, until things really went past the point of no return, and even after that, there's a lot of blue mixed in with the gray and a lot of gray mixed in with the blue.
And especially at this 1861 moment, and for one thing, especially early in the war, the blue guys often wore gray and the gray guys often wore blue, which of course caused some military snafus that cost some lives early in the war. But I think that's significant because you're absolutely right that I don't, I think so often we do think of the Civil War as blue and gray, or I went to Gettysburg. It was sort of the first Civil War battlefield I visited when I was a kid, in fourth grade. And they had, I don't think they have it now, but they had this electric map. Do you remember this thing? Where it was sort of narrated by this portentous 1960s voice, and these lines of red and blue electric lights kind of moving towards each other and smashing against each other.
They still have those here at the Civil War. Try to grow, they have
Do
that
they
still.
really?
Yeah.
I haven't been there yet, actually. It's
they did
ridiculous,
last summer.
But yeah, I just think that's absolutely the wrong way to think about the Civil War. We think about the Civil War as something that we sort of visit on a few battlefields. Let's go and do the Civil War at Antietam or do the Civil War at Gettysburg. But in fact, this entire country was the Civil War battlefield. And I think until you think about it that way, you don't really understand a lot of what it was about. It was fought not just in these famous wheat fields and orchards, but also in thousands of American communities far away from what we think of as the battle lines in the North and in the South. And it was fought within millions of American hearts and minds as well. So yeah, it was a sort of a bluish gray country very much. And that's something that I really especially gotten a sense of since I moved to the eastern shore of Maryland, which was, have you guys been to the eastern shore ever. So it's a very interesting, divided, complicated place that in some ways is sort of very connected to the north. In some ways, I think is almost more unreconstructed southern than Alabama, for different reasons I won't get into. But I work in an 18th century building on the waterfront, and about a block away is our county's Civil War monument, and it's a single, very simple slab of granite, and engraved on the south-facing side are the names of all the local boys who died for the Confederacy, and on the north-facing side, the local boys who died for the Union, and many of the last names are the same. So this is a place where it really was literally brother against brother, which I think gave me an appreciation, as you say, of just how interpenetrated these two sides were.
And even in 1861, it took the North some time to really gear up into a war mentality.
Longer than the South, longer than the South.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even after the surrender of Fort Sumter, it seems like, based on reading this, that there was still this mentality in the North that's like, okay, this is kind of a disagreement that's gotten pretty far out of hand at this point, but we can straighten this out. And it wasn't until like maybe about 3 or 4 weeks later, in Alexandria, Virginia, that a pivotal moment, which you set this up really well with the earlier chapter as well, and a figure named Elmer Ellsworth, at which point the North, after what happens in Alexandria, at that point the North sort of decides, it's like, okay, it's on, it's a war.
Yeah, and even so, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Lincoln himself still sort of expected, as the war began, that he could use a sort of a carrot and stick approach to bring the South back into the Union. He still believed that there was a chance that Southern Unionists would sort of stand up and be counted. That, of course, did happen in some places, in West Virginia, for example, that wasn't yet West Virginia, but certainly not to the extent that Lincoln expected. But it's interesting when you look at the rhetoric of this moment in the war. You find the Northerners certainly inveighing against the secessionist traitors and talking about stringing them up, but they're talking about the leaders. They're talking about men like Jefferson Davis, men like Lewis T. Wigfall. They're talking about going down and hanging Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree, as the song went. But what they're not doing is what the Southerners were doing already at this point, which I found some just remarkable things that were being said. I can find one passage for you from a Richmond newspaper, actually. Where in May 18th, 1861, so this is before any of the battles of the Civil War were even fought, before any Union troops set foot on the sacred soil of the Old Dominion. An article in the Richmond Dispatch says, "We'll meet them in the way they least expect. We will glut our carrion crows with their beastly carcasses. Yes, from the peaks of the Blue Ridge to the Tidewater, we will strew our plains and leave their bleaching bones to enrich our soil." And I just read that, and it just sent a chill through me, that people, I think once people can say that about anyone, let alone their fellow countrymen, a line has been crossed from which it's going to be very, very difficult to ever retreat without a cataclysm. And unfortunately, that's what happened.
And that's also an excellent example of another aspect of this that we talked about as we were preparing for tonight's conversation, which is just the immensity and the richness of the source documents that are available to a Civil War historian. That this is an incredible, the voices of America in this period are just so remarkable once you start opening yourself to what they were saying.
Yeah, and I really think people ask about, well, why does the Civil War still fascinate Americans so much? And I was on the phone as I was driving down I-95. I was talking to a reporter from Le Figaro, the French newspaper. She said, "Why is this Civil War so interesting to you? What does it have to do with American politics?" I was like trying to change lanes and answer these questions at the same time in terms that a French person would get. And anyway, and now I'm losing track of the question. But yeah, so what I told her is that I really do think that a lot of our fascination with the Civil War, we can talk about, politics and ideology, but a lot of it just has to do with what a great story it is, and it has to do with what great voices come out of that time, and not just, the obvious sort of great poets, but also just these ordinary soldiers or ordinary journalists or politicians who wrote incredible pieces of prose. I mean, it was just this moment that was kind of at the perfect time between not enough expression and too much expression. I mean, in the sense that literature had become widely available, education in America was becoming very widespread, so common people could read. They were taking in some pretty good literature, but they hadn't gotten to that point yet where their brains were filled with this sort of styrofoam mush of mass culture. And so you get these just incredible individual expressions. And the photography, of course, too. I mean, that makes the moment so alive. The music, there are great songs from the Civil War. So to me, the power of those stories is really, along with the political stuff, what pulls us in. And as I was writing the book, that was the great pleasure to sort of immerse myself in those words of 1861, sort of like Bob Dylan when he first moved to New York in the early 60s as the centennial was going on, and he was a sort of threadbare young man from Minnesota just off the bus, and to sort of entertain himself in his free time, he would go to the New York Public Library, call up reels of microfilm from the Civil War years, and just obsessively scroll through them. And he said that he wrote afterwards in his memoirs that what he loved were, I think he said that eccentric bearded characters with their strange sermons and orations, with blood and fire. And he said that was actually what his music grew out of, and is still sort of growing out of that experience. So I felt sort of like Dylan, digging in like Dylan to this stuff. But there's so much stuff that you can now find online that's a great gift. But I also felt like I really wanted to, there's something that you just don't get from doing keyword searches in a newspaper database. So I actually went on eBay and I managed to be the winning bidder on a few bound volumes of original 1861 newspapers that sort of lived, on my desk for the next couple of years, and getting even more dog-eared than they were already. Because to me, there's just nothing like being able to open up a newspaper that they were reading that day.
Now, what was it that sent you into this era originally? Why did you decide to devote 2.5 years of your life to the period just before the start of the Civil War?
Well, I'll tell a little story, and then maybe we can open it up if folks have questions, or I don't know what time we're getting to. I don't want to keep people on a fine spring evening. But it started with a sort of a discovery that my students at Washington College and I made on the eastern shore of Maryland, in one of these crumbling old plantation houses that you find there. And when I'm teaching, I always like to take my students sort of out into the real world rather than just sending them off to the library, where they often won't even go when you try to send them. But I take them off into this old house that's been in the same family for 13 generations, if you can believe it. It's not just you Virginians who have deep history. And I'm friends with the family who own it, and they're very nice to let us explore. And they had, and I'd seen this before, an attic filled with family papers. They don't live in the house anymore, but it was just full of family papers, stuffed into 19th century crates and steamer trunks and old Eastern Shore peach baskets. And, I talked to them before about taking these papers and archiving them somewhere. And, like a lot of people with these old houses and a lot of family history, they were very ambivalent about letting go of it. But my students on this particular trip got really fascinated with these papers. And one guy in particular, amazing student of mine, Jim Shelberg, who is a veteran, a Marine. He's a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, very interested in military history, had heard that there was some Civil War history to this family. He said, I want to know what was up with this family at the start of the Civil War. And I want to write my final term paper on this in the semester. And I said, oh gosh, Jim, there are just bushels and barrels and peach baskets full of papers up in this attic. Turned out some 300 years worth. The oldest paper we found was, I think, 1662. Incredible stuff, going all the way through the 20th century. I said, even if, I can persuade the family to let us spend some time poking around up here, the likelihood that we're going to find something that you're going to be able to turn into a term paper is really pretty slim. But he so wanted to dig around that I finally said, okay, well, I'm not going to let you do this by yourself, but if the family will let us, I'll come here with you some Saturday morning. We can spend a couple of hours digging. So we come in on Saturday morning, go up into this attic, and the papers were in such a state. I mean, they were just being eaten by rodents up there. We ended up calling them the mouse turd papers. That was our nickname for them. So that was literally what they were becoming. But we start digging in, and it's clear that many of these bundles are arranged as they were in the 19th century in bundles that haven't been unwrapped. We pull out one of these bundles. It's tied up in yellow silk ribbons that clearly haven't been untied in a very long time, wrapped in a sheet of 19th century paper as a sort of a wrapper. And on the outside it says, William H. Emery's correspondence about his resignation from the U.S. Army, April 1861. And I just handed it to Jim, and I said, Jim, it's not always this easy when you do history, but here it is. So we undid, like a Christmas present, we undid this ancient silk ribbon, opened up this bundle of letters, and inside was a whole correspondence from this man who actually, have any of you heard of this guy, William H. Emery, before? He went on to be actually a pretty well-known Union cavalry commander, but at this moment, he's a career Army officer. He's stationed way out in Indian Territory, in what's now Oklahoma. And he's trying to figure out what to do as the Union comes apart. And as you said, Ron, it was this very difficult moment for Americans deciding which side to take. And on the one hand, he's tied to this plantation, this very old plantation that's run by slaves. He grew up with slavery. He feels, it turns out, very ambivalent about slavery in a sort of a deep way that I think many Southerners actually felt, even though they didn't always admit it, especially when there was a Yankee in the room. But he feels that culturally he's a Southerner, and his allegiances are with the South. He's a friend of Jefferson Davis. His son is actually living with the Davis family at this point, so it's a very close tie. His other son is at West Point and will become a Union Army officer, while the son who lives with the Davises becomes a Confederate officer. And he himself is thinking, well, do I abandon this flag that I've served under since I was a 14-year-old cadet at West Point, almost 40 years ago, fought under this flag in Mexico for my country? But he also ends up, the surprising part is that he's also thinking about other stuff that's not so glamorous, that's not so romantic. And he's writing to his brother and to his wife back in Maryland, and he's wondering what's in it for him. And he's saying, if I go with the Confederates, am I going to become the founding father of this new nation and sort of celebrated as a hero the way that my grandparents' generation, men in my grandparents' generation were? I mean, they had this example. They were the ones who chose right and became the founding fathers. They were the ones that chose wrong and became the hated Tories. And which is going to happen to me? And he says, am I going to possibly be strung up as a traitor? And his wife writes him, his wife who's a native Philadelphian, but who herself feels very ambivalent because of his ties of self-interest. And she writes him, "It is like a great game of chance." And so I thought, wow, that just stayed with me. And I thought, I want to write about this moment when everything felt like a great game of chance. And so after my student Jim had already written his term paper, I said, well, Jim, would you mind if I usurped that topic a little bit? And unless you're planning to turn your term paper into a book, I really want to write a book about this. So that's what I did.
And on that note, I would love to open it up to questions from you folks here.
Yeah.
Well, one person who's always fascinated me is Edmund Ruffin.
Yeah.
Let me see how much. I've heard a lot of things about him. How much of this is actually true? He was a Charleston journalist. He was on the battery the day that the cannon started firing.
Uh-huh.
Was he standing next to a cannon and nobody had opened fire yet, and this young private was going to do it and said, "I just can't." and Ruffin grabbed the lanyard and said, "Hell, I will." He pulled it and fired the first cannon.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I have to say that Virginia was to blame for Edmund Ruffin rather than South
Yeah,
Carolina.
he's got a farm not too far from
Yeah,
there.
exactly. He was a journalist. He was a magazine editor who was
Okay.
a fascinating character. He was very involved in this movement to sort of bring back the glories of the Old Dominion. You know, these glories that were sort of decaying by that point in American history, and as this state that had been the most populous and most powerful in the Union at the foundation of the Union was being sort of superseded by. Virginia has never been superseded in many ways, but economically superseded by the industrial North and by the cotton states of the Deep South. He was full of schemes to bring back the glories of Virginia through various innovative kinds of farming, special
He was the
fertilizers.
first person to apply lime to the soil. He was a real agricultural.
He was an agricultural innovator, but he also becomes increasingly a sort of a rabid Southern partisan, which actually, I mean, it's not wholly unrelated to these sort of visions of glory for the South. He goes down to Charleston much in the same way as Lewis Wigfall goes down to Charleston and is sort of a busybody at large with the Confederates. And now he's somebody who doesn't appear in my book, and I can't give you all the details of his
But
story.
But at the end of the war, he wraps himself in a Confederate flag and kills himself.
I don't think he literally wrapped himself in a Confederate flag, but he went upstairs after a very pleasant lunch with some friends, sat down and wrote a letter swearing that eternal enmity to the damn Yankee race, and shoots himself. But he claimed to have fired the first shot on Fort Sumter. It was probably the second shot that he fired. It was probably the shot that actually almost hit Abner Doubleday.
Yeah.
Doubleday writes about how he's there inside this sort of deep powder magazine trying to catch some sleep before the battle starts, and a shell comes screaming in, and he landed, Doubleday said, in unpleasant proximity to my left ear. So that was probably the shot that Ruffin fired. Does anyone else have a question?
What became of the papers in the attic? Are they all still there, or you?
No, we rescued the mouse turd papers. I finally went to this very ambivalent owner of the house of the papers, and I said, James, I know that you have mixed feelings about letting these leave this house where they lived for 300 some years, but if you don't, your entire family history within a couple of years is going to be mouse turds. Although I didn't use the word turds. And he sort of at that point agreed. He still owns the papers, but he agreed to put them on deposit at the Maryland State Archives, and my students and I had a sort of a second adventure with opening up all these bundles of papers and rescuing them and archiving them and seeing what was in them, and it's just an incredible treasure trove. And so they're now actually mostly digitized, and you can find them on the Maryland State Archives website. They're mostly not transcribed, it's hard to go through them, but they're there.
Did Lincoln let Sumter happen so that the South would strike the first blow?
I think he did. Well, I think maybe to say he let it happen is a little bit, maybe is not quite fair, because Lincoln was faced with a crisis that he had to do something about. It wasn't a question of letting it happen. It was either he had to simply let this garrison starve, which wasn't an option clearly. He would have to issue orders for them to withdraw, or he would have to send a fleet to provision them. I mean, it was this sort of very old law of warfare. They were being starved out of this fort. But what he did do that was very canny was he really checkmated Jefferson Davis, I think, at this point in history. And people have argued about this. And, people talk about it as some sort of a deep conspiracy, much in the same way that they say that FDR invited the Japanese to attack Fort Pearl Harbor and, sent a secret telegram to Hirohito or something like that. Or people say that, George W. Bush actually orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. And I think that's pretty nutty in both cases, frankly. But I do think that Lincoln sort of played a deep game with Fort Sumter. He knew that the war was coming. He knew that the war was likely to begin one way or the other in Charleston at Fort Sumter. And so what he did was something that probably no sort of experienced military commander would have done, which is he sent a relief expedition to Sumter, but he telegraphed the Charlestonians first to let them know it was on its way and sort of when it was going to arrive, so that they could shell it if they wanted to. And moreover, he sent this expedition, he sent rather than this sort of great armed fleet of warships going in ready to withstand the Confederate guns, he sends in these little sort of New York City tugboats, whose main defense was bales of hay that they piled up on the decks to deflect incoming shells. And he tells the Confederates that these ships are basically not going to fire back, that if they're fired upon, then there are other ships that will come and that will defend them. But what he says is this is a routine supply mission to bring food to this group of half-starving men. It's something that probably no experienced commander-in-chief would have ever thought to do, but what it does brilliantly is it just sort of checkmates Jefferson Davis. Because here he is, and what he has to do is either allow this supply mission to peacefully come in and in effect let this group of men remain in the heart of the Confederacy indefinitely, this foreign, as they thought, garrison, or he's going to have to open fire on this unarmed fleet on a humanitarian mission that Lincoln has announced to the world. And what has he got to do? Well, he decides he's going to open fire on Fort Sumter almost immediately before this expedition has a chance to arrive. And that's what he does. And the Confederates do end up seeming like the aggressors in the eyes of the world, in the eyes, importantly, of the North, whom it rallies in a sort of a 9/11 or Pearl Harbor moment, this previously divided North. And to me, that was Lincoln's perhaps greatest masterstroke, certainly in the early part of the war, and possibly Jefferson Davis's greatest mistake that may have cost him the war in winning that militarily useless little 2 acres of federal real estate. He may have lost the whole Confederacy.
What became of the troops that were in after Sumter surrendered?
Well, none of them was injured in the battle at all, except for some, cuts and bruises, basically. As they were actually withdrawing, it was really one of these awful. Another thing I think fascinates us about the Civil War is that there are just all these awful ironies. It's as though some novelist or playwright were orchestrating this story from above. Major Anderson, the Union commander, demands that the Confederates let him fire a salute to the United States flag before they lower it. And they sort of balk at this at first, but then agree that he can do it. And he's dead set. He's determined to fire no fewer than 100 rounds in salute to the American flag. So they begin to do this. His men, of course, by this point, they're exhausted, they're malnourished, they're just sort of half dazed from this battle they've just been through. And they misload one of the cannons, and on the 50th shot, it explodes. And so this undergun salute, like the Union itself, is cloven in half, and with a terrible omen, explodes and kills instantly one of the men of the Fort Sumter garrison, seriously wounds several of the others. And I think very poignantly, they stop the salute. Anderson and his men file very sadly out of the fort. They leave behind this dead man who's one of the most popular members of the garrison, a young Irish private. They leave him behind to be buried by the enemy, as so many dead men would be buried by the enemy in the course of the Civil War. And they march out to the cheers of the Charlestonians as the Stars and Stripes comes down and the Confederate banner goes up. So that's how the battle ended.
Any other questions?
What courses do you teach? Were they related to this period?
I teach a bunch of different courses, some of which are related to this and some aren't. I'm very much committed to the American Studies approach of teaching about the past. I think you can't really understand history without understanding the literature and art of a time and vice versa. So this semester, I teach one course a semester because my academic role is sort of a part-time one, but this semester I'm teaching one of my favorite classes. It's called American Pictures, and I co-teach this class with the chair of the art department. And it's all of American history, sort of from 1600 to the almost present, seen through a series of individual images. And so each week we take one painting, photograph, portrait, and just dive deep into this picture for the entire week. Use it as a sort of a portal into the past. We read literature from that period. We talk about what was going on intellectually, and we take this piece of art as a portal into the past. So that's what we're doing. In the Civil War image that we use is of course the famous dead sharpshooter in the Devil's Den at Gettysburg, and we talk about that, and we read letters from men at Gettysburg and Civil War literature and stuff about the early days of photography. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.'s great essays about early photography. So I just love it. It's a seminar style class. We just spend 2.5 hours talking back and forth, so it's fun.
Now, as after 2.5 years dealing with 1861, are you going to continue along with the Civil War in future books, or?
So 1862.
62.
Yeah, and then the problem is that this one actually ends halfway through 1861. It only goes up to July 4th, 1861. So then I would have to do an 1861 part 2, and that would be like 10 books, and I'd be a really old man by then. But no, I don't think I am going to do another Civil War book soon. I sort of feel like this is what I want to say about the Civil War right now, and there's something else that I feel like I have a lot to say about. Now it's also 19th century America, and so I think I'm going to say that and then maybe see where I am. Somebody asked me, I did an online live chat for the New York Times the other day, and you know, it's crazy. I don't know if you participate in one of these, but like they're, you know, like 100 people all typing at once, and you've got this coming at you. And also, I'm like a 4-finger typist, so somebody comes flashing across the screen, question after question. Somebody types, "Where do you see your book in the Civil War canon?" And I'm like, C-A-N, one N, canon. I'm like, Civil War canon, it's just like warm from the presses. It was published this week. So anyway, I'm not looking to become sort of part of the Civil War canon.
That's what I was actually going to ask you about that. How did you feel about stepping your toe into the Civil War? Because that's such a quagmire of people and competitiveness, and there's a great bookstore on the south side of Richmond that's just a bookstore of Civil War books. And, I've just heard of people who've written in that field that it's a very judgmental crowd. It's a tough crowd.
And I felt like it's the Civil War mafia, and
it is,
I already feel sort of weird in academia because I don't have a PhD. I sort of came into it through journalism, and I thought, well, here I am, and I've just sort of come into the Civil War story, and there are people who have been spending their whole lives working on this.
On just one battle, their whole
careers. Yeah, exactly. And so I sort of imagined the Civil War mafia that would like come and kneecap me in the middle of the night. But in fact, people have been incredibly welcoming. I did 2 events last week in New York, my first 2 book events, and one I was with Ken Burns and David Blight up on stage, and then the second one I was with James McPherson, Harold Holzer, and and Craig Simons, a great historian of the Confederate Navy, and they were just incredibly sweet and welcoming, and just had nice things to say about my book, and a couple of them blurbed my book. Actually, McPherson gave a really nice blurb that didn't make it in time to get on the dust jacket, but he did that, so I really feel kind of honored and